Christian parenting.
Homeschooling is becoming an increasingly attractive option for families. Let's talk about the blessings and challenges of this form of education on Family Vision today.
Hi, my name is Emily Reno. Welcome to Family Vision, the podcast from Visionary Family Ministries, encouraging families through practical, encouraging, and real conversations.
Welcome back. Well, I am going to be concluding this series on education today with talking about the blessings and challenges of homeschooling or home education. When you get into the homeschooling community, you will find that true home educators do not like the word homeschool because they want to adamantly communicate that you are not trying to replicate school at home. And while I completely agree with that premise, because you really can't replicate school at home, I will continue to use the word homeschooling because I just think that people understand that that's the more common word, and that's just what we use in our own home. But I wanted to just say up front that it is really true that when you choose a path of homeschooling, you have to get in your head that you are not going to replicate the classroom in your home, which I did try to do for about 2 weeks when I started homeschooling, where I would parade all my kids down to the basement and say the Pledge of Allegiance and look at a calendar on the wall and try to imitate a classroom setting. And like I said, it lasted not even 2 weeks. I realized very quickly that that style was not going to work. So today we are going to really do another deep dive into this concept of homeschooling and what are the pros and cons of this type of education. And just a little background, again, is that when I've talked about in previous episodes our educational targets and kind of a little bit of my story of how we got into homeschooling, first of all, I was definitely the reluctant homeschool mom because I was Miss Love School, Miss Social Butterfly, and the idea of not having my kids in that environment was just, really, the word was just, I feel like terrified might be too strong, but I would wake up sort of panicking in the middle of the night, like, what am I doing? Like, how can I keep my kids from this great experience that I had? So I was really concerned as a homeschool mom that my kids were just going to be missing out on so many things. And that was just daunting. But as I looked at my targets of what I was trying to accomplish for my kids, homeschooling just kept making more and more sense to me. But another thing that was happening concurrently at the same time that I was really processing and praying about how to educate my kids was just being in high school ministry and a youth pastor's wife and really enjoying these relationships with all of these high school kids, but also becoming very, very aware of what the high school culture was like and the culture of just adolescence, not just in our local high school, but across America. And the interesting thing is that I kept hearing over and over that, if you homeschooled your kids, like they would struggle with socialization. That was probably the number one concern. And I had a similar concern that if you homeschool your kids, how will they be socialized? How will they, fit into this culture? Well, again, having just kind of a front row seat to that culture for 10 years, it really dawned on me, the thought was, do I want them to fit in this culture? Is this really what I'm shooting for? Is this one of my targets for them to feel comfortable in this culture? Because even though I knew many wonderful Christian high school kids, I was not affirming of the typical high school culture. It really was in many ways opposite of a lot of the targets that I was trying to reach. In particular, I would say the one that stood out to me was a love of learning or understanding that learning was a privilege. Because so many kids, just the mindset in high school was one of obligation and kind of apathy and, not really understanding at all how valuable an education is. And there were two talks, and I might have referenced them before on Family Vision, but just had a huge impact in my thinking. They were both by a pastor named S.M. Davis, who has a website called solvefamilyproblems.com. But one of those talks was a talk called What to Expect of a 12-Year-Old. And that talk in particular really challenged my ideas of adolescence and what we were hoping to see, like what kind of character qualities we wanted to see in our kids during adolescence. And that just gave me a different sense of awareness of maybe I have different goals for my kids that in my own education plan that are not going to fit exactly with this idea of what the culture is saying how high schoolers should act. So those were some of the things that really led me, and I've shared that before, but really led me on that path to choose homeschooling. So I want to first talk about the pros of homeschooling or home education. And the first one that stands out to me is relationship building. I don't think there is any other form of education that has more potential for just the strength of relationships because simply put, when you are home educating your kids, you are spending lots and lots of time with them. And you may be familiar with this idea that, there came a thing, it was a parenting thing back more in the 80s, that 90s that kind of talked about how quality time is more important with your kids than quantity of time. And I just need to say I completely reject that because quantity of time is quality time. It's not really about times that have to be all warm and fuzzy and sweet. And that's not what I would call the necessity for building a relationship. Relationship building happens by spending time together and working through problems together and dealing with messy situations together, both relationally or problems in your home together. All of those things, when you are homeschooling your kids, just become so integrated. And to this day, the relationship that I have with my kids, the relationship that my kids have with each other, the relationship my kids have with their cousins, the relationship that kids have with their grandparents, in many ways, I would attribute to our choice to homeschooling because we had more freedom to spend more time with the people that I wanted my kids to spend time with. So relationship building, I would say, is a huge pro of homeschooling. And right along with that is learning together. Like I've said before in my targets, understanding that this love to learn or learning is a privilege was something that as a homeschool mom, I could reiterate and reinforce over and over in my home. I couldn't believe the difference in the education of my children when I was involved with what they were learning. So, for example, when you're studying the Civil War and you're studying that as a family, you're amazed at all the connections that are happening, just in your everyday life. You watch TV and you make a connection. Oh, that's just like what we studied about the Union soldiers, what they had to eat. It's just because we're all in it together. So conversations around the dinner table and the breakfast table, and you're reading scripture, you're reading Proverbs, but you are connecting Proverbs immediately to something you've just learned in history, or you're connecting science with something that you're seeing in scripture. So this whole learning together, I would say personally that I wasn't a very educated person until I became a homeschool mom because I wasn't that great of a reader when I was a young kid, and I probably would have never stumbled into all of the knowledge that I've stumbled into simply by being a homeschool mom. So learning together is a huge pro. The next pro, I would say, is just this intimate knowledge of our kids' character and of their learning styles and interests. Again, going back to those days as a youth pastor's wife and seeing just, again, lots of high school kids through those 10 years, one thing that really struck me was that there was a lot of parents who were not really aware of the character of their children. And both sometimes positive or negative. And I don't want to say that in any way to condemn or slight those parents, because I think we can all fall into that. But it was interesting to me, I would say, that by the time these families or kids were in high school, they were spending so much less time together. I mean, a kid's high school world can be extremely busy, that I was just surprised that there was more families than I expected to have such a disconnect of not really knowing either what their kid's character or just strengths and weaknesses. It was surprising to me. And I would say that's just a huge pro of homeschooling, is that you as a homeschool teacher just get this front row seat to all the different character issues and the learning styles, their strengths and weaknesses. You get that front row seat, and it's just amazing knowledge to have because it helps your kid. You can help your kid navigate through those things when you know them. And if you don't know them, you can't really help them with that. So another big pro is just intimate knowledge of our kids' character, learning styles, and strengths and weaknesses and just interests. And then another pro I would add to that is just simply freedom. Freedom to run our family schedule in accordance with our family needs and desires. So, for example, I was able to put my kids in just simple things like, I have a large family. So having, 3 kids in Park District soccer, that means 3 practices in a week. This is not travel soccer. This is not some intense program, but this is just simply taking your kids to the local 1-hour practice for soccer. Parents know that every little activity that you add creates much more busyness into your schedule, busyness into your getting dinner on the table, getting your grocery shopping done, your laundry done, all of that, every activity you add just creates more complication. And what was lovely about homeschooling was just the fact that my kids were home all day and I could be spending this time with them. And then we would involve ourselves in a lot of after-school activities. And I was with moms that were talking about how busy they were and they never saw their kids. But it dawned on me that, okay, but they're not seeing their kids all day. And then they're going into this extra busyness where I did have the freedom to really control my schedule in such a way that I could prioritize, what was important to me. And not just the daily schedule, but the field trips and, going in September to a family vacation where everything's not crowded and cheaper, and we could do that. That was such a blessing. And again, tied into all of my own educational targets because I had the freedom to make those choices about our schedule. So let me now dive into some of the cons that I would say are common among home education or homeschooling families. And I want to speak to one very clearly. It's kind of one of those things where people say your greatest strength can also be your greatest weakness. So in homeschooling, I think it's a huge strength for parents and teachers to have this level of control over our kids' curriculum, over our schedule, over all sorts of things that we want to do. But here's how that can be a weakness. Often because homeschool moms or dads or educators are so used to controlling everything, they really can have a hard time accepting things that they don't like. The local, what we call the co-school in my area, where they have a school for kids who homeschool, but they go 1 day a week. And I always kind of think about the job of the director of that school. It's like herding cats because, all these parents have their own individual ideas of what should happen in the classroom or how things should be done. And because they have that kind of homeschooling mentality, they can sometimes just assume that they should always exert this type of control over their kids' educational environments. And I think that's a con in a couple ways. One is that I don't think that's helpful for our kids to think that whenever things aren't going the way that they like them to go, that they should just be able to control it and make it different. I fell into this trap just like a lot of homeschool moms did. And I just can remember one time telling my kids, hey, listen, this is what it was like when I went to school. You got your class list. You got the teacher, whether it was the good teacher or the bad teacher. You got in a class with friends that you didn't like and you couldn't have lunch with anybody. And guess what? You dealt with it. That was just reality. And in many ways, homeschool kids and homeschool families need to have this balance of accepting that part of growing up is accepting things that you may not necessarily agree with and that you don't have control over. And just like I said with one of the pros of public schooling, as I see moms who are very dependent on prayer, I see this is a weakness or a trap to look for if you're choosing homeschooling, is that you need to be dependent on prayer, just like a mom who's sending their kids to public school, and understanding that, no, you don't control everything, and that clearly giving the message to your kids that God's in control and there's going to be things that you like and don't like. You don't always have to switch things to make your kids happy. So that, I think, is a con to watch out for. Another con, I would say, does go back somewhat to this socialization, is that I do see that many homeschool kids are very well socialized when it comes to adult environments or environments with other homeschool families, but there can be a weakness in just getting to be in a full peer environment. Like they might feel uncomfortable. Like, my kids, for example, we get to go to family camps during the summer. So they had a lot of exposure to always being in like programs with all kids their age, which is very different from a lot of homeschooling activities, because in homeschool activities, you're with all ages. I think it's very, very true that homeschool kids are better socialized in dealing with younger kids and older kids and adults. But I would say, pay attention to how well they do just in being comfortable in all peer environments, because that can be a challenge. It's just an environment that they're not as accustomed to. And I think we need to be aware of that and maybe be more proactive in putting them in things where they can be comfortable in those settings, like Awana or church programs. And another con, I would say, is just simply the small world of homeschooling. And we see this as a challenge that, kids, as they grow up, they need to have their world expand. And one of the things that I think can be hard for us as homeschool moms is just so sweet and wonderful to have those great learning experiences with our kids. And yet when they're 12, 13, when they're passing into those early teen years, their world needs to open up more. And often some homeschool families get into some problems when maybe the mom or the younger kids aren't quite ready to let those kids have more life outside of their home, because every kid's world needs to start expanding by age 15. They're ready for more. And that can be a trap. Just to kind of highlight that a little bit more is that adult privileges should always increase with adult responsibility. What we often see in the world around us, which we kind of reject, and I agree that we should reject, is this idea that kids should have all these adult privileges. Like they should have the freedom of privacy and they should have the freedom to be on all social media that they want. And they live in a world where their adult privileges are way high and their adult responsibilities are extremely low. Like not much is required of them. But I have seen in the homeschool community that kind of flip, where we see a lot of really responsible young kids that are still very restricted with very low adult privileges. And I would say either when those things are out of balance, that is a situation that can provoke anger. Well, it can just provoke kids, because those things need to go together. So I hope that this little deep dive into home education was helpful for you. This might be something that you are considering or have considered just recently due to COVID and all this upheaval in our educational system. But I would say that the final thing I want to add to this series of education is that You as parents, first of all, have a lot more power than you realize when it comes to the education and discipleship of your children. So remember, number one, that education and discipleship go together, and they need to go together. Then number two, it's parents who are responsible for the education and discipleship of their children, and that Scripture makes it clear that God is going to hold us accountable for how we train our kids, not the public school teacher, not the Christian school teacher. We have this authority, so we need to decide what's the best form for our kids. And then also that because we have that responsibility, we are the ones who can develop a plan. We are the ones who can decide what are our targets, what are we hoping to accomplish in the discipleship of our children. And then finally, and probably most importantly, as you are praying through your educational choices for this next year, is to really take this decision to the Lord and to surrender your will to His. He says that when we seek Him with all of our hearts, we will find Him. God is in this with you. He is going to lead you to what the best path is for your family for this year. But it may not be the path that you're expecting. So I encourage you, surrender your will to His and let Him lead you in this most important role of educating and discipling your children. Well, thank you for joining me on Family Vision. You can connect with us at visionaryfam.com or on Facebook, and at Instagram, I'm at Amy@VFM. And please also check out my book, Not So Perfect Mom, Learning to Embrace What Matters Most, because in there I take a lot more in-depth dive on building those relationships with our children, which is one of the most important gifts that we can give our kids. So thank you for being with me today on Family Vision.